Hello, everybody, and welcome once more to Democracy and Education. My name is Helen Ozia, and I am your lecturer for International Relations and Political Science. Today, I'm going to present the second chapter of my book, Education for Democracy in the 21st Century. Welcome again. The name of the second chapter is You Live in a Democracy. What does this mean? But let me remind you that if you want to obtain the best results from this online course, get your book, Education for Democracy in the 21st Century. Before I start with the presentation, I want to announce that all images contained in this presentation are either generated by artificial intelligence or have a Shutterstock or other license. I would like to begin the chapter by talking about the meaning of the word democracy, which is so widely used in so many different contexts. Well, democracy comes from the Greek language. It has two roots. The first one, demos, which means people, just like in the word demography. And the second one is kratos, which means authority or power, just like in the words plutocracy or aristocracy. Democracy has its origin in ancient Greece, specifically in Athens, approximately 2,500 years ago. That is, it is older than the Christian era. However, democracy in Athens was direct. That is, citizens voted personally in favor or against political initiatives. However, when we hear democracy nowadays, we have to think about different concepts. The first one is that power emanates from the people. In other words, it's the people who have the political power, the people who express their will in regular elections, and it is the citizens who elect their representatives with their vote. That is what we think about when we hear the word democracy. Our political leaders are also called public servants because it is their responsibility to serve their people and to represent them and defend the interests of the electors. Here we have an illustration of how democracy was in ancient Greece. You have here two citizens who have to select a stone, either a black one or a white one, from two different bowls, and then place the stone in a bigger bowl. Okay, and then at the end of the voting process, the stones would be counted, and then it would be decided for or against a certain political initiative. However, as you can imagine, this is not the way things work nowadays. And my question to you is, how do most democracies work today? Maybe with the exception of Switzerland, where there is direct democracy and citizens do participate in plebiscites, to decide on initiatives that will impact their lives directly or indirectly. And the other question is, why? Well, in the 21st century, most democracies are indirect. That is, citizens elect representatives who, in their view, that is, in the view of the citizens, best represent them and defend their interests. Now, why is this so? Well, imagine a country like the United States of America, where maybe 150 million people can vote, are allowed to vote because they're citizens. Imagine calling them every 2, 3, 4 weeks to decide upon every single political initiative. That would be quite impractical, right? Now, how things are done nowadays is different because it is representatives who vote for or against initiatives in Parliament or in Congress. And in a democracy, there must be at least 2 political parties to choose from. Otherwise, we cannot talk about a democracy. It is a monarchy or an autocracy or a theocracy because the people must have the right to choose. However, not all democracies are the same. There are 2-party systems and multi-party systems. Here, this is the American system where there are 2 main actors in the political arena, and it's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. These 2 giants who monopolize the political struggle. Now, there are some minor political parties at the state and at the local levels, but not at the national level. Now, in Germany, like in Scandinavian countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, democracies are parliamentary and there are several parties. I have here the example of the German parliamentary democracy. There are 2 big actors, which are the Social Democratic Party and the Christian Democratic Union, the bigger parties. But then you have a bunch of small parties, like, for example, the Greens, the Left, the Nationalist Party, AfD, the Liberal Party, etc. Now, how do elections work in a multi-party system? In the 2-party system, it's the winner takes it all. Whoever gets the majority of the votes is the party that gets to form a government. This is not the case in multi-party democracies. What happens is that it's very unusual for just one party to get a majority, of 60% or even 51%. Very unlikely. What happens is that they seek partners and they have to form coalitions. Of course, this means political compromise. And then when a coalition can form a majority of at least 51%, or even in cases where there is no absolute majority, the coalition with the greater number of votes gets to form a government. That is in multi-party political systems. However, one fundamental characteristic of democracy is the peaceful transfer of political power. We have here 2 images. This is 2016. You have here President-elect Donald Trump being congratulated by Barack Obama. The transfer of power was peaceful. Maybe many people did not agree with Donald Trump becoming president, but they were forced to accept the results of the election. The transfer of power here is from one party to the opposing party. In Mexico, in the last election, the transfer of power was within the same political party. Again, about 40% of Mexican voters did not like the victory of Mrs. Claudia Sheinbaum, but, well, they had no other alternative but to accept the results because about 60% of the voters, had elected Sheinbaum as their candidate. Now, how does the transfer of political power work in other political systems which are not democratic? Let's take a look at the overthrow of ISIS in Syria. Well, as you can see, these guys are armed with machine guns. There was a lot of bloodshed. There was a lot of death. There was a lot of destruction. And the transfer of power was everything but peaceful. Now, the question is it feasible for Syria to achieve a peaceful transfer of power when the ex-dictator was overthrown in such a violent way? Now, let's go to civil and political rights in a democracy. We have here this image symbolizing equality of rights between men and women. As a matter of fact, it's between men and women, the elderly and the young, blacks and whites, Catholics and Protestants, minorities, people who have certain disabilities, etc. It doesn't matter who you are a citizen and you are entitled to the same treatment just like everybody else. Another important characteristic of democracy is the right to demonstrate peacefully, like here, these demonstrators who are against war, or here, these animal rights activists demonstrating for animal rights. Now, what is fundamental when we talk about the right to demonstrate? Well, it has to be a peaceful demonstration. You don't need to throw rocks, to spit, to kick, to beat others in a democracy. Why? Because I talked about the fundamental principle of pluralism when I presented chapter 1. So then you do have a right to express your views, to express your ideas, but it has to be in a peaceful manner. What is the role of civil society in a democracy? We have here 2 examples of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, Greenpeace and Amnesty International. These organizations are called NGOs because they're not financed by any national government. And the question is, if they cannot participate directly in elections, what role do civil associations and NGOs play in a democracy? And how does their existence influence political life? Well, they cannot participate directly as political parties, but they do have a key role in influencing public opinion. People support them, people listen to NGOs and civil associations, and of course, political parties and public servants must listen to what the NGOs say, their values, what is important for them, and the supporters of these organizations, because otherwise they might lose the next election. And how does their existence influence political life? By creating public opinion or changing public opinion. So they do play a very important role. By the way, these are not usually present in authoritarian, theocratic, or totalitarian governments, or if they are, they cannot work openly because they're prosecuted. Freedom of religion, which is a cornerstone of democracy. What does freedom of religion mean, and what does it not mean? And what are the limits to religious freedom? We have here two examples of a couple getting married in a church and of two religious representatives distributing pamphlets about their religion out on the street. Well, in a democracy, each individual decides on his or her religion or beliefs. In other words, your parents may not force you to follow a religion. I'm talking about adults, okay? You can leave whenever you wish, or you can become a member of another religious organization because it's your problem as a citizen. As I said before, no one has the right to impose his or her beliefs on others. Religious organizations have an obligation to respect the law, even if the law goes against their religious principles. For example, here we have an example of a same-sex marriage in Spain. Most people in Spain are Catholics, and the Catholic Church is against same-sex marriage. Well, these two guys cannot get married in a church, but they can sure get married by the civil authorities of the city of Madrid. Okay, so then religious organizations may not condemn the laws. They may not impose their principles upon the law. And there are diverse religious creeds to choose from. Or maybe some people don't have a religion, don't want a religion. Well, in a democracy, that is all right. That is definitely not the case in a theocracy, where there is one state religion and not following it is against the law. And as I said before, well, individuals decide whether or not they wish to belong to a religious community. Now, let's talk about conflicts between religion and the law in a democracy. Well, as a matter of fact, religious organizations might come and have come into conflict with democratic governments for different reasons. Normally, it is the clash of regulations, or when religious organizations do not respect the democratic principle that every citizen has a right to choose his or her religion, when they force their beliefs upon their members, etc. Think about a conflict between a religious organization and the state. Well, in countries like Mexico, the Witnesses of Jehovah have had problems with the government because they do not allow their members to participate in any political activity whatsoever. For instance, they may not vote. Jehovah's Witnesses children may not participate in civic ceremonies at school, and that creates friction between that religious organization and the Mexican state. And the question here is, which rules and regulations take precedence for citizens? The religious ones or those of the state? And the answer is, of course, rules and regulations of the state have absolute priority over religious regulations because they are valid for the whole population. Another fundamental principle of democracy is the division of powers. This is crucial, people. Why? Power is divided into three branches. The legislative is the branch that makes the laws, votes for the laws, enacts the laws, and it takes place either in Parliament or Congress. The executive is the branch of government that enforces the law. We're talking here about the government or the administration. And the judicial is the branch of government that interprets the law. Now, the Supreme Court or the judiciary might decide that certain laws are unconstitutional. The Constitution of a country, also called the Magna Carta, is the basis of all other laws. No laws may go against the Constitution. They're unconstitutional. In other words, they're not valid. Why is this so fundamental, people? Well, because in non-democratic governments where there is no division of powers, the judiciary becomes an instrument of the executive, as does the legislative branch. Okay, there's a concentration of powers, and the ordinary citizen has nowhere to go if there is an abuse of power. Well, this is the answer. Why is the principle of the division of power so important? Because otherwise the judiciary and the legislative would become instruments of the state or of the government. Let's take a look at non-democratic governments. Here we have an example of a theocracy in Iran, the late Ayatollah Khamenei. This is China, a highly authoritarian government, a one-party state, and this is North Korea, which is even more authoritarian. We could say it's a totalitarian system because the government even controls the economy of that state. Now, what are the characteristics of these forms of government? Well, there are no free elections, or we could say no elections whatsoever. The transfer of power is not usually peaceful. Well, you could say in a monarchy, when the king dies, then the crown prince becomes the king. But otherwise, if we're talking about theocracies or authoritarian regimes, the transfer of power is violent. There's a lot of bloodshed. There is no religious freedom. For example, in communist countries, even nowadays, like in North Korea, religion is prohibited. And in theocratic systems like Iran, it is punishable. There's the death penalty for leaving the state religion, which is Islam. There is no freedom of religion. Okay, there is respect for certain minorities, but Iranian Muslims may not leave their religion because that is punishable with death. The struggle for power is not peaceful. We see that in the news constantly. Demonstrations that are suffocated by the police, hundreds of people who are killed or tortured or who disappear just for demonstrating against the regime. And, well, there is only one political party. Not more than one. You cannot choose from two or more political parties. And hand in hand with this goes that there is only one ideology which is accepted and promoted by the state, for example, in North Korea, which is Marxism, Leninism, and all other ideologies are forbidden. And well, as I said before, there is no separation of powers, making power absolute, encompassing the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. The judicial and the legislative become instruments of the executive. Another very important characteristic is that citizens are not equal before the law. For instance, in theocracies like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, there are laws for men and laws for women. Punishments are different. Rights and responsibilities are different. In authoritarian regimes, the public servants have all of the rights, and ordinary citizens have very few or no rights at all. Now, talking about rights and duties as citizens of a democracy, where are these specified? How can I know what rights do I have? And what limits do our rights have? Well, usually our rights are specified in the Magna Carta or the Constitution of our country. In the United States, they are enumerated in the Bill of Rights, the inalienable rights of the citizen. Nobody can take them away from it. And regarding the limits, we see here an example of a peaceful demonstration, equal pay for equal work. Now, what if the demonstration were violent, if the women were spitting and kicking and throwing rocks? Is that legal? The answer is no. And why should it be violent? In a democracy, you have a right to express your views because there is the cornerstone of pluralism. Our rights and duties as citizens in a democracy. Let's begin with the rights. Freedom of expression, oral or written. Freedom of the press. We can publish our ideas freely. However, there are limits. We may not libel people. We may not slander. We may not make up stories about people who we don't like. Freedom of religion, as long as our religion respects the regulations of the country, the laws, not a religion that calls for human sacrifice, for example. Then there's no freedom of religion in that case. Freedom of association, this does not exist in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. What does it mean? I can meet with a group of friends or with an association anytime, any place. There is no limit as to the number of people who can participate in a political meeting or in an event. Duties or responsibilities. You have to respect the rule of law. That is the equality of all citizens before the law. You have to accept the fact that the state holds the monopoly on the use of force through the police. And this means that only the state may administer justice. You cannot take justice in your own hands if somebody wrongs you. And respect the rights of others. Okay, everybody loves freedom of speech and freedom of the press for themselves, but not necessarily when we're talking about the rights of other people we don't like saying things that we don't like. Well, sorry, because just like we have freedom of expression and freedom of the press, other people who we don't agree with or who we don't like also have the same rights. What is the meaning of the equality of all citizens before the law? Men, women, older adults, young people, homosexuals, minorities, and others are treated in the same way by the authorities. It's not like in Saudi Arabia where there are laws for men and laws for women. That is not the case. However, only citizens enjoy the full range of rights and responsibilities, not foreigners, and definitely not if you are an illegal alien in the country. Now, you do as a foreigner enjoy certain rights guaranteed by international treaties and conventions, but never the same rights that citizens of that country have. Before I end this presentation, I have some questions for you or for your students if you are a teacher. What is the rule of law? What does it mean? And why is it a cornerstone of democracy? Number two, why is the division of power so crucial in a democracy? How does life look like for citizens in countries where there is no division of powers? Number three, how can we define a legitimate government? Number four, what is the function of the legislative branch in a political system? And number five, what is a non-governmental association? And what is the difference between an NGO and an international organization? I thank you for your attention and remind you, don't forget to buy your book, Education for Democracy in the 21st Century. See you next time when I present Chapter 3. Thank you for your attention again.